surcharge on electricity exports. For the 1.5 million American homes and businesses that Ontario powers, homes and businesses in Minnesota, Michigan, and New York.
The relationship between the United States and Canada, traditionally marked by friendly ties and strong trade cooperation, is now under extreme strain since the election of President Donald Trump in 2024 and his subsequent announcement of sweeping trade measures. Tensions between the two nations have been escalating. What began as a promise to combat illegal immigration and drug trafficking has evolved into a full-scale economic confrontation, impacting industries on both sides of the border and leaving millions of people in uncertainty. With tariffs, countermeasures, and diplomatic disputes intensifying, the question arises, how will this trade war shape the future of U.S. Canada relations and the global economic landscape? On November 25, 2024, President Trump made a striking declaration on Truth Social. He announced his decision to impose a 25% tariff on all goods imported from Canada and Mexico, justifying the move as a response to the alleged failure of both nations to control their borders and prevent illegal migration into the U.S., particularly from Mexico and Canada. Moreover, Trump also aimed at curbing the flow of fentanyl, a drug responsible for countless deaths in the U.S., which, according to the administration, was being funneled into the country through Canada and Mexico. Trump's words were not merely rhetorical. The administration had already been preparing for this trade showdown, and the tariffs were seen as an inevitable escalation of his America First policies, which emphasized economic nationalism and protectionism. As expected, the announcement sparked immediate backlash, with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau denouncing the tariffs as reckless and warning of dire consequences for both countries' economies. The global markets took a sharp turn downward as investors reacted to the uncertainty introduced by the U.S. administration's aggressive trade stance. The trade dispute quickly intensified in the weeks that followed. On January 20th, 2025, President Trump signed a memorandum directing his cabinet to assess the emergency caused by the continued migration crisis and fentanyl flows from Canada, Mexico, and China. This memo set the stage for the imposition of tariffs, urging national security measures that would align with his broader strategy of securing U.S. borders. The trade war that followed these announcements was more than just a bilateral dispute between the U.S. and Canada. It had the potential to disrupt long-established supply chains, shaking industries that were heavily reliant on cross-border trade. From agriculture to automotive manufacturing, both nations found themselves locked in a battle that could have profound consequences on their economies. The U.S. has been heavily reliant on imports from Canada for decades, particularly in energy. In 2024, Canada accounted for over 60% of U.S. crude oil imports, an amount that equates to over 4 million barrels of oil per day. The trade in natural gas, electricity, and other vital resources like uranium and coal further cemented Canada's status as an indispensable trade partner. In fact, nearly 39 terawatt-hours of electricity were imported from Canada in 2024, helping to power key U.S. regions, including the Northeast and Midwest. In light of this, the Trump administration's tariffs had the potential to cause not just economic harm, but also jeopardize the stability of the U.S. energy grid. The imposition of a 25% tariff on Canadian energy exports was seen as an extremely risky move that could result in immediate and severe power shortages for millions of Americans. As the stakes grew, the international community began to scrutinize whether the administration's policies were truly in the U.S. national interest or whether they were the result of political maneuvering. The economic consequences of these tariffs quickly became apparent. On February 1st, 2025, Trump officially enacted a 25% tariff on Canadian and Mexican goods, alongside a 10% tariff on imports from China. Within days, both Canada and Mexico retaliated with their own tariffs on U.S. exports. The S&P 500 dropped sharply, losing 1.7% on February 4th, 2025, its worst performance since December 2024, reflecting the growing anxiety in global markets. One particularly critical area of concern was energy exports. Ontario, Canada's industrial powerhouse, is responsible for supplying vast amounts of electricity to the U.S., especially to states like Michigan, New York, and Minnesota. As much as 95% of the electricity imported by the U.S. from Canada comes from this province, mainly in the form of hydroelectric power from Quebec and Ontario. In fact, if these power supplies were cut off, key U.S. regions could experience blackouts, further compounding the energy crisis that could result from these trade measures. Furthermore, the dispute was not limited to electricity. Canada also supplies essential materials like crude oil, natural gas, and uranium, all of which play pivotal pivotal roles in U.S. industries. The U.S. is heavily dependent on these resources to fuel its automotive, defense, and technology sectors. In 2024, Canada exported over $16 billion worth of crude oil to the U.S., a large portion of which was processed into gasoline and diesel at refineries in states like Illinois, Michigan, and Texas. Canada's role in U.S. energy security made any disruption to this trade deeply problematic. Looking ahead, the future of U.S.-Canada trade relations appears uncertain. Both nations are now engaged in a cycle of tit-for-tat tariffs, with the potential for escalation looming large. Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has repeatedly warned that Canada will respond in kind to U.S. tariffs, while Ontario Premier Doug Ford has signaled that the province is prepared to take drastic measures, including suspending electricity exports entirely. The situation is further complicated by President Trump's unexpected one-month delay on the tariffs in early February 2025, following lobbying efforts from major U.S. automakers. Companies like Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis had warned of severe disruptions to supply chains and potential job losses in the auto manufacturing sector if the tariffs were enforced. The temporary reprieve did little to calm investors, however, as market volatility continued to persist, with the S&P 500 and NASDAQ dropping significantly on February 6, 2025. Despite the delay, the Trump administration made it clear that the tariffs on Canada and Mexico would go into full effect on March 4, 2025. When the tariffs were officially imposed, Canadian officials immediately retaliated, announcing reciprocal 25% tariffs on key U.S. exports such as agricultural products, manufacturing goods, and consumer items. The trade war was no longer limited to industrial sectors. It began to affect daily consumers as prices for basic goods started to rise. At the same time, U.S. automakers successfully lobbied for a one-month delay on tariffs on auto parts, but this only provided a temporary reprieve. Many are concerned that continued uncertainty around trade policies could lead to long-term disruptions to production schedules, especially in industries that rely on just-in-time inventory systems. As U.S. companies await further developments, the trade standoff has underscored how fragile modern supply chains are to policy disruptions. As the trade war between the U.S. and Canada intensifies, both countries stand to lose. The U.S. risks energy shortages, manufacturing delays, and a rising cost of living, while Canada faces the prospect of serious economic damage, particularly in sectors like energy, manufacturing, and agriculture. The longer this dispute drags on, the harder it will be to return to a stable trading relationship, especially as businesses on both sides of the border grapple with changing tariffs and shifting regulations. What remains to be seen is whether President Trump's hardline stance will ultimately strengthen the U.S. economy or whether it will backfire, causing more harm than good. Will Canada stand firm in the face of these challenges, or will it buckle under the pressure? And, crucially, will the international community be able to broker a resolution, or will this trade war become a protracted conflict that leaves lasting scars on the global economy? As tensions continue to rise and trade relations deteriorate, one thing is clear: the economic and diplomatic future of North America has never been more uncertain. Will the United States and Canada be able to resolve their differences, or will this conflict only escalate? The answers to these questions will likely shape the trajectory of international trade for years to come.